What comes to mind when you think of a planned economy run by leaders with visions of a utopia driven by the industriousness of the downtrodden workers of an exploitative system? Workers that only need a little bit of money and land to create a veritable Garden of Eden for the good of all the people in it. A system built off of the philanthropy of government, long-standing institutions, and the embracement of new ideas like the innate goodness and perfectibility of human beings. You're probably thinking of communism or something. I can feel it. Which, of course, you can learn all about because you can read books from Amazon to learn about anything you're interested in. Sometimes I have trouble finding books for inspiration, and that's why it's great to have a full library to choose from at Amazon. You can browse through thousands of awesome books on economic history and much more. Learn from great authors about how the world works and all those interesting topics you've been wanting to do a deep dive on. Depending on your preferences, you can pick between Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and Audible. There's a lot of great deals up right now, so scroll down, click the link below, and check out all the great options available. Well, no. Sorry, it's not socialism or communism coming to save the day this time. The colony of Georgia is probably not what comes to mind when you think about banning slavery, a planned economic system, and a government of educated, idealistic, philanthropic leaders. But that's exactly how the colony started. I'm sure there are some people out there that are saying, "This sounds incredible. Why haven't I heard of this?" Well, that's easy. It's because it was a major failure. Promotion for the region of Georgia started a few decades before the creation of the colony, with propaganda being written about its fertile soil, a warm and temperate climate, and its economic advantages. One of the most famous being a discourse concerning the designed establishment of a colony to the south of Carolina in the most delightful country of the universe by Sir Robert Montgomery. Wow, that is definitely propaganda. I mean, no offense to Georgia, I'm sure it's a fine place. I'm just saying, in the entire universe? Anyways, this propaganda, and much like it, telling the potential and guaranteed future success of the region to exaggerated measures, was flooded into England. Much of it explained the numerous benefits that colony would impart on the British Empire and its mercantilist goals. Mercantilism is a form of economic nationalism based on the idea that a nation's power and wealth could be increased by maximizing exports and minimizing imports, as a way to build gold reserves in a world believed to have a set or mostly static amount of wealth. The propaganda painted a picture of a colony where silk, medicinal herbs, wine, hemp, flax, figs, and olives could be grown to relieve Britain from spending money on exotic goods from the Mediterranean and Asia. And of course, it would be a roadblock to stop the expansion of the Spanish Empire, which had colonies just to the south in Florida and the Caribbean. In the early 1730s, James Oglethorpe and a few influential Englishmen armed with this propaganda and Enlightenment ideas that assumed every group of people could prosper only if, under the right circumstances and with the right amount of money, decided to combine philanthropy with British mercantilism. James Oglethorpe was a former British Army officer who devoted much of his time to helping the poor and debtors of London, and he and a group of charitable investors suggested to King George that they move the poor and unemployed to the territory of southern South Carolina between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers to create a controlled and planned economic venture. King George liked the idea and granted the trustees a charter in 1732, which organized them into a corporation with the right to run the colony for 21 years, and the colony of Georgia was officially established in 1733. In order to get people on board to move to the colony, the trustees, in their promotional writings filled with mercantilist rhetoric, boasted about Georgia's climate, soil, and its prosperity to come, as per usual, but they also explained their idealistic reasons for creating the colony, claiming it would be a haven from religious persecution, that England could send its poor to work in Georgia as charity settlers, whose way would be paid for to ease unemployment in England, and that the colony would turn them into productive Englishmen. It would stop the drain on gold from buying exotic goods from Asia by farming them in Georgia, and each colonist would also be a soldier to protect the colonies from the natives and Spanish expansion. It would be a win-win for the empire and the citizens of Georgia. However, the colonists were met with much different circumstances when they arrived in Georgia. Georgia's laws supposedly granted the colonists the rights of Englishmen, and the crown had the right to oversee the laws within the colony at any time. However, there was no system set up for the colonists to oversee the laws themselves. James Oglethorpe was appointed to oversee the military and civil happenings in the local government, and he subsequently appointed multiple other members of government. The colony received a massive amount of subsidies from the English government, churches, and multiple Georgia trustees, which made it unnecessary for the settlers to pay taxes, and consequently the trustees never needed to set up any local government to raise taxes. This effectively created a corporate dictatorship without any representation, unlike every other mainland colony at the time, and it never allowed the Georgian people to gain any leadership within the colony, a system that was made much worse by the slow pace of transatlantic travel necessary to communicate with the trustees, making it incredibly difficult to adapt to situations that arose in a timely manner and very difficult to collect feedback from the actual colonists. The trustees were insistent that they kept complete control over the economy and laws to achieve their goal of creating a perfect mercantilist economy. They attempted to create this system with multiple economic regulations, which included the prohibition of rum, the creation of a semi-feudal land system, and the banning of slavery. This was much different than most of the other colonies in the South, but the regulations made perfect sense to the trustees with their overzealous Enlightenment ideals. Prohibiting rum had dual motives. It was meant to slow the trade between the Spanish colonies in Georgia, and it was also a form of social engineering. The trustees believed that the consumption of rum would make the colonists lazy, but as we know, colonists love their rum, and the prohibition was almost completely ignored, creating a thriving black market for alcohol. The land within the colony was freely given out as part of a grant system, but it was incredibly restrictive by design. Land was granted at limited sizes. The most amount of land an independent settler could get was 500 acres. But they had to transport between 6 and 10 white indentured servants at their own expense to work that land, and each indentured servant who finished his service was promised 20 acres or so when released. The population of servants and independent settlers was only about 1/5 of the colonists in Georgia, though. Most of the population were the charity settlers. These were the quote-unquote worthy poor, who were on an all-expenses-paid trip with 50 acres of land waiting for them when they made it to Georgia. The trustees gave them food, clothing, tools, guns, issued funds for teachers and midwives, and a whole lot more. However, this is where some of the labor issues really started, and the cracks in their philanthropic ideology began to show, as the worthy poor were not necessarily skilled workers. These people were unemployed and homeless people from the streets of England's cities, which stifled their plans for building a colony full of exotic goods that needed skilled labor to grow and produce. Imagine rounding up a city's homeless, like from Skid Row in Los Angeles, for example, and attempting to make a thriving farming society full of productive and sober people out of them by giving them free land, food, and equipment. They would be completely unprepared for this and have no clue what the hell they were doing when it came to farming. I mean, I, and most people I know, would probably be completely lost as well. Honestly, if you put it in this context, it sounds nothing short of insanity. Anyways, the small land grant sizes and servant quotas in Georgia were created to ensure that the population would be close enough together to mount an effective defense against Spain or any natives that might attack, unlike the large, sparsely populated plantations in other colonies that were filled with mostly slaves. Also, none of the colonists actually owned this land in the way we would think of today. They could not sell or borrow money against this land or even pass it down to anyone that they pleased. So there was no way to gain any more land through the common channels. This means you would be stuck with the same amount of land for your entire life. It's a system that actively works against anyone's goals of becoming rich farmers with a lot of land, and basic economics tells us that this clearly reduces the incentive to stay in the colony and work hard when there is no path to becoming wealthy, breeding laziness and complacency. The feudal land system only allowed for the land to be inherited by a male heir, a system called tail-male, rather than fee simple, which would allow anyone to inherit or sell the land they own. This was a way to keep unmarried women from taking land from a soldier who would need to protect those 50 acres. However, this caused its own issues as well. If a farmer didn't have a male heir to inherit his land, he would make decisions based on a shorter time horizon. Why would you want to make improvements on land that you were not going to leave to anyone? You might as well just let certain things fall into disrepair as you get older because no one you know will need to use it. This system was an attempt at maintaining wealth equality as well, so the gap between the rich and the poor would not widen like it did in many of the plantation economies of the South. However, it served mostly to keep everyone poor, very similarly to basically every government attempt to maintain wealth equality throughout history. Poverty was obviously not the goal of the trustees, but they knew that reducing the amount of land someone could own could reduce their power and ability to make money, and if no one gets rich or consolidates land, then there is no one to challenge your rule. The trustees' methods of creating equality through economic planning and equal land distribution actually created its own inequalities and inefficiencies. Giving people equal amounts of land in such a large area does not mean that people are actually getting equal land. Just because everyone gets about 50 acres of land does not mean that they're all going to be suitable for growing crops, raising animals, or even building on. And because these farmers couldn't trade the land, they wouldn't be able to carve out more usable tracts of farmland even if they were offered a chance to by their neighbor. This is often one of the main reasons why government distribution never works better than the market. It can never account for things past a certain amount of depth because it would simply take too much time and money to guarantee that everything is truly equal, leading to infighting, inefficiency, and ideas among the people that the government is playing favorites. The land inequalities caused huge issues when the trustees imposed ridiculous, sweeping regulations that the settlers had to follow equally. Some of the conditions for receiving land grants included that the planters cultivate their land within a specified time, to plant specific types of products and often to grow a certain yield, and to require them to pay high quit rents for every 100 acres, basically just yearly rent. And if they failed to do so, the land would be taken back by the trustees. However, not everyone was able to do these things as easily as the next person because of unequal land quality distribution. One of the most contentious issues in Georgia was actually the ban on slavery. The trustees were so afraid of the problems slavery would cause that they went as far as attempting to rid all black people from the entire colony, even free blacks. Most of the trustees believed slavery made slaveholders lazy, which was a problem for the model society they were attempting to create, and they believed that to not allow it would rid the colony of lazy people. However, they had military and economic reasons for banning slavery as well. Each white farmer and servant was supposed to be a soldier, and if they started bringing slaves into the mix, then they would be diluting the amount of people who would be willing to fight for their land. Also, the trustees thought that black slaves were simply not up to the task of farming silk and other luxury goods that they were attempting to grow in the colony, which they assumed needed more skilled labor, not mass labor. To them, slavery implied a plantation economy, which also implied fee simple land, which meant that the land could be consolidated into larger and larger plantations, which would completely destroy their perfect little playhouse of an economy that they were trying to create. Instead of slavery, the trustees wanted indentured servants to do much of the laborious work in Georgia, as they would eventually become citizens with the ability to manage their own land. But there simply wasn't enough to go around, and the indentured servants failed to replace the work of the slaves in other colonies. This led to a labor shortage that created inflated prices for regular goods that could be bought for a fraction of the price in other southern colonies where slavery provided cheap labor, with one account stating that lumber cost 4 times more in Georgia than in the rest of Carolina, and that there were large tracts of land suitable for growing rice that were being left unused for the lack of the right economic system, of course meaning slavery. The wages got so high that it was an employee's market, and when the indentured servants' contract was up, they would either leave the colony or get their own land in Georgia, which would further drive down the labor pool. This affected every part of Georgia's economy, making the lofty goals of growing silk in Georgia even more difficult to achieve as well, which was supposed to be one of the main products of this utopian colony. The trustees ignored previous silk growing failures in South Carolina and went ahead with their plan to make Georgia the silk capital of the British Empire, starting with James Oglethorpe, regulating that many colonists
clear and cultivate 20 acres for each 100 within the space of 10 years, and plant upon the same 200 white mulberry trees, and maintain them and 100 others upon every other 10 acres.
They figured because Georgia had mulberry trees, and silkworms live on mulberry trees, then it would be the perfect place for silk. However, these trees were not even the right kind of mulberry trees for silkworms, which led to major inefficiencies in silk production and nearly half of the silkworms dying off. They poured immense amounts of money into growing silk, hiring silk growing professionals, and importing silkworms from Italy. The silk-making venture did produce some silk over the years, just enough to keep the propaganda fresh, but it grew very slowly and never became profitable, no matter how much money they poured into it. The labor shortage also made it nearly impossible to hire people to harvest silk at the normal wage of 1 shilling per day when they could easily make 2 shillings a day somewhere else, and with most of the colonists working on maintaining their own land. The climate, which was consistently lauded for being similar to China and Italy where silk was grown, was clearly not the same, and frost ended up killing much of the silkworms as well. And of course ignorance and plain old laziness also contributed to nearly completely destroying Georgia's silk production multiple times. Eventually, all of these bizarre regulations and laws started to catch up with the colony, with many of the colonists unfamiliar with frontier life coming to Georgia with promotional propaganda in hand advertising a land of plenty and prosperity, turning their backs on the colony and deserting it. Later, many of the long-standing colonists began to follow as well. Those who chose to stay in the colony began to rally against the trustees only a few years into the experiment by openly and secretly defying the main tenets of the Georgia trustees. For example, the colonists came up with ways to circumvent the prohibition on slavery by quote-unquote renting out the slaves from South Carolina. They would pay the actual price of the slave and simply rent them for 100 years of their life. And many of the government officials ignored it when it became obvious that Georgia could not compete with other southern colonies without slavery. The trustees labeled these people the malcontents, and the malcontents clapped back by accurately labeling James Oglethorpe the southern dictator. A Georgia writer wrote,
"The malcontents were sensible of the realities of making a living in Georgia and making the colony prosper, not by impractical idealism and high rhetoric retailed by the Georgia propagandists in England, but by the hard realities of life, by being wicked like the South Carolinians and like them having slaves, by owning land to keep or sell as they pleased, and by raising the ordinary articles of commerce."
In 1738, the malcontents cited two things that they thought would pull Georgia out of its economic slump, major labor shortage, and general people shortage: a limited amount of slavery and fee simple land, the ability to buy and sell and inherit land as they pleased, which seems like the absolute least they could do considering the state of Georgia at this time. However, in 1739, James Oglethorpe predicted that by continuing to prohibit slaves,
the idle will leave the province and the industrious will fall to work.
essentially saying good riddance to those who wanted slaves, and you can go live in that gross Carolina colony. Yucky. But this reaction led to many of the most hardworking people in the colony leaving as well. After 3 years of being completely ignored and maligned, in 1741 the malcontents added to these demands, including the abolishment of quit rents, a system of self-governance like the other colonies, and the ability to settle wherever they wanted. This was a big no-no for the trustees because it was the antithesis of their entire experiment's goals, and it would essentially mean giving up power to the colonists. This began the trustees' years-long battle to desperately hold on to power in the colony. Their inability to make consistent compromises and the personal attacks only made the backlash worse and led to more and more extreme demands from the side of the malcontents. All while the trustee-appointed secretary, William Stevens, whose job it was to send status reports of the colony back to the trustees in England, claimed that things were going much better than they really were. It was likely because of William Stevens reporting such inaccurate representations of the status of Georgia that things moved so incredibly slowly for the entire reign of the trustees, with no real information being provided to the trustees. They were almost completely in the dark on what they could have fixed and should have reformed. Thomas Stevens, William Stevens' son, actually took the side of the malcontents. He felt that
nothing short of the rights and liberties of other British subjects or colonies were intended to be allowed such settlers, who certainly took the same for granted before their leaving Great Britain to go to Georgia.
Basically saying the settlers haven't gotten the rights they were promised. The malcontents sent Thomas Stevens to the House of Commons in England in 1743 to present their requests directly. This led to a small compromise that was supposed to allow new colonists who paid their own way the ability to acquire up to 2,000 acres of fee simple land. But unsurprisingly, this change never actually made its way to Georgia, as the Crown refused to review it. Eventually, everything came crashing down for the trustees. Their system was clearly not working, and they reluctantly gave in to more and more demands over the years, treating each concession with contempt and as an attack on their principles. In 1750, they repealed the ban on slavery, and in 1751, they allowed for fee simple land. By 1752, 1 year earlier than their charter allowed for, they gave up control of the colony to the crown in utter failure. Even though the trustees had some interesting ideas and were clearly pointed in the right direction, at least morally, like the abolition of slavery and helping the poor, their plan was carried out disastrously, and, ironically, without much concern for the colonists of Georgia that they were trying to help. Over the 20 years of its existence, the British government donated more than £130,000 into Georgia, more than the British government had ever spent on any non-military project up to that point in history, along with church and private donations, including over £90,000 from one of the trustees. Just like later economic planners throughout history, the trustees blamed their failure on a lack of funds, not on their hubris in assuming they could plan an entire economy and social system, their ridiculous restrictive regulations, or their lack of acceptance from the population at large. This is clearly not a new story. However, it seems we never truly learn the lessons of the past. Today, economic planning is a mainstay of modern life, even after the abysmal failures of economic planning in the 20th and 21st centuries, right behind us, in places like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, all over Africa, Asia, and South America. We still look to politicians to modify our economy and, in some cases, completely envelop entire industries. We trust politicians to put price controls on us, and we let them take nearly a quarter, or in some cases much more, of our hard-earned money in taxes, to provide more and more money to corrupt government institutions that often do the opposite or something completely different than their perceived purpose. It's no wonder why economic planning always fails. Whether in a mercantilist, fascist, or socialist system, it doesn't matter. The economy is like the weather, and if someone told you they could control the weather and make it sunny and temperate all year round without any horrible consequences, most people would think they were being scammed. All I can say is don't fall for the con. Anyways, that's everything. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video. Check out my sources in the description if you'd like, and feel free to help us out with a tip to our Ko-Fi. If you are a creator struggling to make content, check out Dangsphere in the link in the description. A production meets marketing company that helps creators turn their stories into content that grows their audience and business. And of course, stay free.